Hey, friends. Welcome to my second episode, or as my buddy John would like me to call it, this little node. Um, and welcome to on this wonderful evening here down in Tampa Bay, and this great time of year. We got playoffs starting with the NBA playoffs and college playoffs, and most importantly of all, we have the NHL playoffs. So it's just a great time of year. Really wonderful, beautiful outside. That's why I decided to join it and be outside. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion and Jefferson's Bourbon. That is actually a really nice kind of a craft distiller bourbon right here. And they like to call themselves the very small batch, or they even have some where it's the ridiculously small batch bourbon. This one that I have is a part of their Ocean series, which kind of comes from one of their buddies, or Joey, who is the founder, and his buddy, who is Chris from Oshark, which is the discovery ship and the ship that goes around the world basically trying to capture, tag, record information, and do research and try to discover new information about these mysterious creatures such as great white sharks, tiger sharks, and many other shark species to try to help them and to bring greater protection to that species. So basically, Jefferson's Bourbon, Joey, who is the founder of Jefferson's Bourbon, who started it probably I think around 20 years ago, and it was the brainchild of him and his father, and his name is Chet, and basically is a really well-known bourbon historian. And they basically are kind of continuing the tradition that was started by their great-great-great-great-grandmother back in 1790s, where she got arrested for supposedly distilling spirits without a license. So they kind of carry on that great tradition, and he named his bourbon after Thomas Jefferson, who, kind of surprising enough, our third president, one of my favorite presidents, was not a huge fan of whiskey. I actually like to call it the devil's drink. And he was more of a wine fan, wanted to try to have the country be more in favor of wine drinking, but sadly enough, the country decided, nope, bourbon was their spirit, and that's the one they wanted to stick with. It was the drink of the common man, where wine at the time was more of a drink of the aristocrats, royalty, and not really affordable by people who basically worked on farms or in the cities. So they couldn't really afford wine, so whiskey was their choice. And even though he wasn't a huge fan of whiskey, he did end up creating a lot of laws that helped it prosper, to help it grow and kind of become America's spirit. And he actually played a pretty central role in the topic of today's episode or node, in that he was very opposed to the excise tax after this country, after the American Revolution. President Washington and his new Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton. Mostly Alexander Hamilton's idea was to basically consolidate all this debt that was incurred by the war and basically bring it into a national debt. And his way of paying for that debt was to start a tax, an excise tax, called the whiskey tax, that was approved by Congress in 1791. And as you can tell, hey, many people, especially many American farmers at the time, did not like this because, well, hey, we just fought a war against taxation from a foreign government who basically was taxing us on the things that helped to make this country what it was, which, tax on molasses, because back then during the Revolutionary War and before, America was actually the number one rum distiller in the world. We distilled more rum than anywhere else in the world, and so we needed molasses. And we also were a very big whiskey distillery or whiskey distillation country as well. So to basically start a tax that would tax something that the American people had just fought against, you can definitely say that they were not thrilled with this tax and are very big fans. So actually, many of the farmers in Western Pennsylvania vehemently opposed the tax and actually downright refused to pay it. And basically giving a big FU to the new young federal government. And they challenged the government for this because, the tax was pretty unfair. While distilleries in the East, in the cities like New York, Boston, Baltimore, those big distilleries could, handle this new tax because they were pumping out new whiskey like no one's business. Small distilleries such as the rural farmers who were basically growing crops during the season and in the off season were making whiskey, because back then the transportation system in the U.S. was pretty lousy. It was very dangerous into trying to transport whiskey or actually transport their crops such as corn and rye, because you try to transport it would take months or weeks, and it was a good chance that you would lose half your crop before it would ever reach the market. So the best way to make sure that it reached the market safely was to distill it into whiskey. But the thing is that the way the tax was set up, they were taxing the farmers based on the size of the still, and it was kind of based off the fact that they were thinking that the distillery was running year round, which it wasn't. The farmers were growing crops one season and then they were distilling the spirits in the next. So they were basically being taxed for a product that they weren't even producing, and it made it very difficult. So as you can see how this would be a big problem. And to kind of be a little bit different, to try something new out for my show, we're going to have a quick little trivia question. And the question is if you know, and don't cheat, because I will be giving out the answers by the end of the node, is who were the only two people arrested and tried for treason for the Whiskey Rebellion? And basically, what was the name of the general inspector who the first battle of the Whiskey Rebellion was fought against? So yeah, if you want to comment down below and give me your answers. Again, hey, I will be giving those answers at the end of the video, so don't cheat. But yeah, please comment. Let me know what you think the answers might be. And so getting on with the video, it was even though it was not very well liked by many of the representatives, especially Thomas Jefferson, he was the number one of opposition against the bill because he thought it was unfair to many of the farmers, and he was a very big believer in having the U.S. be an agrarian, I know I'm totally saying that wrong, but more of an agriculturalist society, where Alexander Hamilton wanted it to be a more industrialized society. But basically Thomas Jefferson didn't get his way. And Alexander Hamilton, with the backing of President George Washington, was able to get the bill passed, and it became the new tax of the land. And in 1794, we have our first real challenge to this new government, this new form of government, because it was still kind of forming. I mean, we didn't know really which way we were going to go, if we were going to go to a monarch, which Alexander Hamilton actually kind of wanted to have, him and a bunch of the Federalists, which was one of the political parties at the time. They wanted more of a strong federal government, a centralized bank, and they also wanted a monarch. And they wanted, George Washington to be that monarch. Well, George Washington didn't want to be that monarch. All he really wanted to do was help to kind of grow this country, and then eventually retire and go and back to his farm on Mount Vernon and retire, grow his crops, distill his whiskey, and just retire as a happy old man and war veteran. So basically, this kind of led to that first skirmish, and in 1794, we had the Battle of Balor Hill, as it was referred to. More like it was a quick little skirmish. And it was actually the militia who went up against, and was actually the Mingo Creek militiamen, went to go fight the Inspector General John Schneebels. And I don't know if I'm saying that name right, but he was in his fortified home up on Bower Hill with a couple Union or new U.S. soldiers, and they had a fight, and two of the militiamen died during the fight. The leaders were Oliver Miller and James McFarland. And then also there was a couple of U.S. soldiers that were died in the battle as well. So this was kind of the first bloodshed of the Whiskey Rebellion, and really kind of the only bloodshed of the Whiskey Rebellion. And after this, and actually real quick, one of my bourbons that I wanted to bring up on the show, but I just couldn't get it right at the time before the show, actually commemorates this battle. It's called the Bower Hill Bourbon. Really nice bourbon. You get some really nice kind of like dried fruits notes in it. I think it has a little bit higher of a rye bill to it, but very good. Would go really well on its own, or if, let's say, you wanted to mix it into a Manhattan Old Fashioned or whiskey sour. But it's from Kentucky, out in Louisville. I highly recommend that you guys go and try this bourbon. Just like the Jefferson's bourbon, definitely really two amazing bourbons that would be a great choice to have, especially on a nice, amazing evening like tonight. And sorry if the lighting isn't great, but still trying to learn a lot of this stuff. And my friend tried to help me out with one of these lights, and I really want to give a shout out to her because it is probably making it a little bit better. So thanks, Stacy, for giving me this light. But kind of getting back to the Whiskey Rebellion, in that after this skirmish, it really basically was like a challenge to George Washington. So what he did was he gathered up a militia and he led it himself. So he's actually the only U.S. sitting president to lead troops into battle. And he rode up from Washington to Western Pennsylvania, just right outside of Pittsburgh. And by this time, a lot of the rebellion or the rebels fled, leaving Western Pennsylvania and going into places such as Kentucky. And that's kind of how we started, where Kentucky became the center of the bourbon world, was that people fled Pennsylvania to Kentucky, discovered that this was a really lush land that had amazing soil, that they could grow corn, which they were introduced to by the Native Americans. And in such, this kind of was what started bourbon, and why Kentucky is so well known for bourbon, was because of this whiskey rebellion. And so by the time George Washington and his militia got up to Pennsylvania, and he was not a happy camper because his dentures were cutting into his gums. So, and of course, as you can imagine, riding up on horseback from Washington all the way up to Pittsburgh at that time was not a fun journey. So by the time they got there, many of the rebels had fled, and only a couple were still there. And here's the trivia question. The only two people to actually be arrested and found guilty of treason were named was John Mitchell and I know I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Philip Weigel. And they were later pardoned by George Washington for their actions. But basically, this was kind of that first challenge to the new government, and basically helped solidify the U.S. government, helped make it a strong government, and really helped kind of solidify the country at the time. But as we go back to Thomas Jefferson, and like I said, on top of many other things, but one of the biggest things what he did was that when he became our third president of the United States, he repealed the tax on whiskey, and basically that helped to free up and make it more profitable for small farmers to continue to produce whiskey. And it's thanks to Thomas Jefferson that we can enjoy a nice glass of whiskey on a night like tonight. And just to I know I totally forgot that I hadn't even tried it a little bit, but and one of the great things about this Oceans is you definitely kind of get the nice salty air, that salted caramel flavor in it. And it's just got a nice little smoky note. And it's just you almost have a little bit of orange in there. And just a very nice, smooth, refreshing bourbon. And goes great neat. And would go amazing with whatever you like to drink and enjoy bourbon. So I hope you guys have an amazing night. Again, comment, let me know what other bourbons you like me to have on the show. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. And thanks again, Stacy, for the light. And thanks again, everybody, for watching. And I hope you have a great night. Hope to have the next episode up soon. And go Bolts and cilantro.